It was supposed to be quiet. The forest of the Ardennes, thick with snow and silence, had offered weary American soldiers a false sense of peace. For weeks, the front line stretched thin, but still, and the trees held no secrets. Until 20 a.m. on the 16th of December. 1944. That morning, the sky cracked open with artillery fire. A storm of iron and flame descended from above as German gunners deliberately set their shells to explode in the treetops, raining splinters like wooden shrapnel onto the stunned Americans below. V-1 rockets screamed overhead, and from the dark woods came the marching boots of a force long thought broken, the Wehrmacht. This was not a counterattack. This was a last gamble, a lightning strike through the snowy Belgian countryside. Fueled by desperation and blind ambition, Adolf Hitler, facing collapse on all fronts, had staked everything on a plan, so audacious it bordered on madness. To punch through the Allied lines, cross the Meuse River, and capture Antwerp, splitting the British and American forces in two. His hope that the Allies would fracture, that the Western Front would collapse. But what followed instead was a battle unlike any the war had seen. A clash of steel, frost, and human will known today as the Battle of the Bulge. 80 years on, the snow has melted, but the questions remain: why did the Allies not see it coming? How did a shattered German army nearly turn the tide of war? And what did it cost the men who stood in his path? To understand the offensive, one must return to the crumbling state of Nazi Germany in late 1944. After the Allied landings at Normandy in June, German forces had been pushed steadily eastward. Paris had been liberated in August. By September, Allied troops were approaching the borders of the Third Reich. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was a mere 350 miles from Berlin, and inside Hitler's bunker, paranoia and delusion brewed. In September, the Führer summoned his generals. He proposed a new offensive, not just a counterattack, but a total reversal of fortunes. The target? The Ardennes, the same forest he had once used in 1940 to outflank the French and British. This time, however, the gamble was greater. He believed lightning could strike twice. 3 German armies, the 6th SS Panzer, the 5th Panzer, and the 7th, totaling 400,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles, would attack across a 37-mile front. Their goal: break through the American lines, seize the Meuse River crossings, and take Antwerp in 4 days. By doing so, they would encircle and destroy the British and Canadian armies in the north, forcing the Western Allies to sue for peace. It was a bold plan, but it had 2 fatal weaknesses. First, it relied entirely on surprise and the belief that bad weather would ground Allied aircraft. Second, it depended on speed. The spearhead of the attack would be the 6th SS Panzer Army, led by SS General Sepp Dietrich. At its tip was Kampfgruppe Piper, a powerful armored battle group led by the ambitious and ruthless Joachim Piper, a veteran of the Eastern Front. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, would drive toward the critical road junctions of Bastogne and Saint-Vith. Without those hubs, no advance would be possible. On the southern flank, the 7th Army had one job: protect the offensive's vulnerable left side. At 5:20 a.m. on the 16th of December, the plan was set in motion. Thunder cracked across the Ardennes, artillery fell like rain, and American outposts manned by green recruits were the first to be overwhelmed. One of those outposts stood at the small village of Lanzerath, held by 18 men of the 99th Infantry Division. Their commander, Lieutenant Lyle Buch Jr., watched in disbelief as German paratroopers Fallschirmjäger appeared from the woods. Against all odds, Bauch's men held their ground for an entire day. They killed nearly 100 enemy soldiers, at a cost of just one man. But their real victory, they delayed the advance of Kampfgruppe Peiper, forcing the armored spearhead to fall behind schedule on day 1. Elsewhere, Chaos unfolded. In the center, the 106th Infantry Division, untested and undermanned, was caught entirely off guard. Communication broke down, American lines collapsed, and in the high command, confusion reigned. General Eisenhower, Supreme Elite Commander, was celebrating a recent promotion. When the reports came in, General Omar Bradley dismissed them. Let them come, he had said, but Eisenhower knew better. Within hours, he halted all ongoing offensives and began redirecting every available reserve toward the Ardennes. Among them were the famed 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. They were exhausted, undersupplied, and missing men, but they would soon become the only hope of stopping the German tide. The Ardennes offensive was built on a fragile foundation: secrecy, surprise, and speed. The Wehrmacht achieved the first two, but the third unraveled almost immediately. The first failure came not from resistance, but from the forest itself. Heavy tanks like the King Tiger weighed over 70 tons. They were marvels of armor, but the narrow, icy roads of the Ardennes weren't designed for behemoths. Bridges collapsed. Vehicles slipped off embankments. And when Kampfgruppe Peiper did begin to advance, it found itself crawling, not racing toward the Meuse. But if terrain was a silent enemy, the American infantry was a screaming one. Across the front, small units often cut off, freezing, and without air support refused to give ground. At Saint Vith, a crossroads town critical to the German timetable, Major General Alain W. Jones' 106th Division made a fateful stand. Though 2 of his regiments would eventually be surrounded and captured, Jones's command bought precious hours that forced von Manteuffel's armor to veer off course. Saint Vith wouldn't fall for nearly a week. Elsewhere, an incident changed everything and darkened the offensive with a stain that would never wash out. On the 17th of December, near the Belgian town of Malmedy, 84 American prisoners of war members of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion were executed by SS troops under Peiper's command. They had surrendered without resistance. They were marched into a snowy field and mowed down with machine gun fire. A few survived by feigning death beneath the bodies of their comrades. They crawled away and brought back the truth. The Malmedy massacre ignited a fire of vengeance across the Allied lines. Units began fighting with renewed, ferocious energy. For many Americans in the Ardennes, surrender was no longer an option. Not after Malmedy. Peiper, who had been delayed by both American resistance and poor roads, pressed onward. His force captured the town of Stavelot, but the bridge ahead was blown. Just as his men arrived, at every crossing, he was blocked. Engineers destroyed bridges faster than Peiper could reach them. Fuel ran low. Weather worsened, and yet he pressed forward until finally, American air power returned. On the 18th of December, the skies cleared for the first time since the offensive began. U.S. P-47 Thunderbolts descended like thunder, strafing columns, blowing convoys apart. Smoke columns rose where tanks once rode. German troops began to call them Yabos wasps that hung in the air, stinging with fire and steel. It was the turning point. The Allied air forces launched more than 500 sorties in one day. German columns were cut to ribbons, fuel convoys were annihilated, and Paper's dreams of reaching the Meuse burned in the snow. By the 19th of December, Eisenhower had issued new orders. Bastogne must hold. The small Belgian town, nestled at the heart of 7 converging roads, was the key. If Bastogne fell, the Germans could resupply, maneuver, and perhaps still reach the river. If Bastogne held, the Bulge would die there. That day, General Anthony McAuliffe's 101st Airborne and elements of the 10th Armored Division rolled into Bastogne. They had little ammunition, no winter gear, no tanks to match the King Tigers they would soon face, but they had orders to hold at all costs. In the chaos of the days that followed, one message captured the spirit of the battle. On the 22nd of December, a German delegation approached Bastogne under a white flag. They demanded surrender. McAuliffe's response was as short as it was legendary. Notes? When asked to clarify, one of his officers explained it simply, "It means go to hell." There's something about the sound of frozen breath, the whistle of artillery over snow, that makes a man forget how close death really is. Back on the northern flank, Paper's force had finally been cut off. He was out of fuel. His men were surrounded at La Glise. The King Tigers that had once thundered now sat still in the snow, useless. Under cover of darkness, Piper ordered his men to abandon their vehicles and retreat on foot through the woods. Only 800 of the 800 men who had begun the thrust would return to German lines. It was not a battle anymore. It was a death march. And still, the Fuhrer refused to concede. By Christmas Eve, the snow had become an enemy of its own. The cold was not metaphor, it was killing men. Frostbite claimed toes, fingers, ears, limbs blackened and fell silent. Tents were buried under powder. Foxholes became ice coffins. And for the men holding Bastogne, the siege had become a purgatory. Shells fell at night. Snipers hunted by day. Inside the perimeter, American medics ran out of morphine. Some wounded froze where they lay. K rations were reduced to half. Civilians, thousands of them, hid in basements with children crying from hunger and fear. And yet, the town held. When Christmas morning dawned clear and cold on the 25th of December, 1944, the war above the clouds changed everything again. Skies opened like a blessing. Overhead, the low drone of C-47 transport planes signaled the start of one of the most successful air supply missions in military history. More than 300 tons of ammunition, medicine, and food parachuted into Bastogne, into that tiny, shattered dot on the map now surrounded by death. And from the east came sound, the low, thundering growl of tanks. Patton's Third Army had broken through on the 26th of December. Task Force Bomb burst into Bastogne via the narrow corridor at Assanois. The siege was lifted. Bastogne, though bloodied, bombed, and reduced to ruins, was not taken. It had never fallen. It was, as the headlines later said, the town that stopped Hitler. But the offensive wasn't quite dead. Not yet. To the north, remnants of the German 2nd Panzer Division had reached the village of Celle, just 3 miles from the Meuse River. It was the furthest penetration of the entire campaign, the final flicker of Hitler's fantasy. And there, it stopped. British forces under Field Marshal Montgomery closed in from the north. American forces under Patton pressed from the south. The jaws of a vast Allied counteroffensive slammed shut. Within days, the entire German salient, the Bulge, was being squeezed. Thousands of German troops were trapped or forced to retreat. They left behind frozen corpses, shattered armor, burned villages, and a myth of a resurgent Reich that had, once again, tried to win with speed and deception, but it had not worked. Hitler had thrown his last strategic reserves into a blizzard, and they had vanished into the snow. You could follow the battle's path just by walking from shell crater to burnt-out tank to fields of scattered boots. The trees still bore the black tattoos of fire. By mid-January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. Germany's gamble had cost them nearly 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Over 600 tanks were destroyed. Fuel shortages worsened, and the Eastern Front, long ignored, now beckoned with horror. The Soviets were advancing. For the Americans, the cost was also staggering. 80,000 casualties, more than any other battle in the war, and yet they had held, not because of superior planning, not because of better weather, but because men, many of them barely older than 20, had refused to run, in frozen foxholes, in shattered barns, in roadside ambushes lit by tracer fire. They endured. Some called it stubbornness, others called it heroism. History calls it the turning point of the Western Front. After the Bulge, Germany would never again mount an offensive in the West. The Ardennes, even today, is quiet again. There are still trees with their tops blown off, stones where tanks once burned, markers where men fell, but the questions echo not through the woods, but through time. What if the weather had held? What if Piper had reached the Meuse? What if Bastogne had fallen? What if Hitler had diverted those divisions eastward to meet the Red Army? History is not made only by those who act, but by those who wait, die in, and hold the line. In the Battle of the Bulge, it was the defenders' cold, tired, and forgotten who shaped the outcome of the war in Europe. And in the falling snow of that last desperate German offensive, something melted in return. The illusion that the Third Reich could last. ATA, if this documentary moved you, we invite you to subscribe to Legacy Files, where history lives, breathes, and remembers, and where each story is told not just with facts, but with reverence